just to thank NUI Galway, and in particular a great friend, Pádraig Kenna, for the invite today, and the European Movement Ireland. I think without further ado, we're going to get into the presentations, and then we'll have some space for questions at the end. So please use the Q&A box there to send us in some questions. So first of all, over to Barbara Steenbergen from the Brussels office of the International Union of Tenants. You're very welcome, Barbara.
Thank you very much, Bob, and greetings to the audience, greetings from Brussels. I'm very happy that you are all still here, because it has been already a long and interesting morning, and now it's the last panel, and let's see what we can have as an added value for you, as an additional information you haven't heard before. Many important things have been said. I would like to come back to our point of view, the point of view of the tenants unions. First of all, shortly introducing the International Union of Tenants. We are extremely old. We are established in 1926, and actually we are not only a tenants union, but we also represent what we call the poor owners in the post-communist countries. Those people were able to buy their apartments, their houses, but they are in a very bad shape. So in the Eastern countries, we represent even the owners, but we are the International Union of Tenants. And our goal is to have a fair housing policy for those who want to be a tenant. Actually, it is also a choice to be a tenant. We have heard before that many people think that home ownership is the best you can do in your housing career. Well, as a person coming from Berlin, I would not say that, actually. As you all know, perhaps Berlin is the city with the highest percentage of tenants all over the world. We have currently 86%, and nobody of the Berliners would even say, why should we become homeowners? Because we don't want to be a slave of the banks. So it's another point of view that we have. And let me tell you a little bit about tenants representation, why it is important that we organize, and also what we think would be an ideal world for a fairer housing market from the point of view of the tenants. So first of all, I think it is very important to know that the tenants movement is a very old movement and part of the social movement. We have been founded in some countries together with the trade unions. So it is a very old tradition that you become a member of a tenant union when you want to improve your housing conditions. This is not in every country of the world like this, but it's mainly in the European countries. But in those countries, we also have very strong tenants unions. And tenants unions play an incredible role when it comes to the definition of housing policies, on the definition of strategies, on a definition about the rent law and the tenancy law. And I think this is very important to know, especially for you, dear colleagues, here in Ireland, because actually Ireland is a little bit a blind spot on our map. There are not strong tenants unions in Ireland. You are not so well organized. And one of my missions for today is to encourage you, organize yourself, establish tenants union, and try to play a very important role when it comes to the negotiation of your rental contracts, when it comes to the negotiation of rent control, of rent stabilization mechanisms, when it comes to the negotiation of more public, social, and affordable housing. This is very crucial for us to tell you there in Ireland. It is important to organize, and it's important to have a counterbalance with regard to the landlords. And we do not see that so far in Ireland as it should be. This is one point I think important to make. What I want to emphasize, because we are talking here about the European policies, level policies for European housing policymakers. What have we been doing good so far? Well, I think there are two interesting things that happened in the last years. First of all, we managed to have I think, one of the most hands-on action plans when it comes to the provision of affordable housing at EU level, which was published by the EU Partnership for Affordable Housing. And the coordinator is amongst us, Michaela Kauer. She was one of the speakers in the panel this morning, representing the historically, I think, best housing policy we have, the city of Vienna, but still the best housing policy you can get, because Vienna always said, we will never abandon our public and social housing stock. The opposite is true. Our goal is to remain, to stay the biggest landlord that we are. So the city of Vienna owns 220,000 social housings. And I think this is very, very important to know. When you want to play a significant role on the housing markets, I think it is important to have strong public and social housing providers owned by the city, owned by the state, owned by the regions. So this is extremely important. What we also did well at the European level lately was the initiative report on affordable housing for all. Also, one of the speakers already said a little bit about that. Kim van Sparentak was the rapporteur on this report, but this was really a game changer at European level. We are working at European level, many of you here on this panel, since many, many years, but the Kim van Sparentak report changed a lot, because it opened doors for us, for the housing policy people that have been closed before. I'm going to give you some small examples about that. What is in this report? For the tenants, talking about our point of view. First of all, crucial issue, how to describe the fairest housing markets for tenants. Well, a fair housing market for tenants is a housing market where a long-term rental contract, an unlimited rental contract, is the norm and not the exemption. And this is, I think, something very important to know, to have a long-term unlimited rental contract. This is the main category to ensure security of tenure. This is important. Another point in this report at European level, how can you change your housing market to the better? Well, by rent price stabilization and rent control. When I was checking a little bit the Irish housing market, what happened lately, we can see that your rents are skyrocketing high. You have a massive problem with the supply of affordable rental housing. You have a lot of luxurious rental housing with rent prices around the 2,000 euros. But this is not the classical rental market where people, the normal people, the key workers in the cities do have access to. What we have also heard from Ireland, that everything what is now put on the rental market has an enormous increase in rents. So the average increase in rents is 6.8% from the last year till now. This is inflation. So what do we have to do? What can you do? I think very clearly there has to be a very clear rent control and rent stabilization mechanism. And this can be only implemented by the government, because the market will not solve your problem like that. And obviously there is also a problem with supply in Ireland, because there is too much supply for, let's say, the luxurious sector and too less supply for the affordable housing sector. So, but perhaps we can talk about that a little bit later. What is also extremely important is that we have more policies which go into the direction of tenure neutrality. And tenure neutrality means, it's a technical term, that home ownership, rental housing, and cooperative housing are treated in the same way. So financially, so we have a clear bias towards home ownership in every country of the world. To overcome that, it's not easy, but I think it is necessary, because we know that only promoting home ownership will lead people into even more poverty because less and less people can afford to become homeowner. And we know this from the crisis in America. Remember, there it all started for people, forcing people into home ownership who could not afford that. One of my last points, perhaps interesting to know with regard to the EU Green Deal. The EU Green Deal will be, I think, the most challenging thing that the EU has done so far when it comes to the renovation of houses. Yes, they have big plans. They want to go into a carbon neutral housing market. Well, I wish you a lot of luck with that. Problem is still, if you do a regeneration, if you do a renovation of the houses, in the majority of the European member states, all these investments of the landlords can directly be passed on to the tenants, which means that the tenants pay for the renovation. How can you then guarantee that the tenants after renovation can still stay in their houses? I think this is the challenge. And nobody has ever given an answer to that. We know that the Green Deal is completely underfinanced. We heard it already from our colleagues from Housing Europe. And there is no mechanism that protects the tenants. There is a technical term for this. It's called renovictions, evictions by renovation. And this is the threat that most of the European tenants will face in the near future because there is no net for them. The only way how we can get out of this, that the EU Green Deal will become a massive threat for the tenants and the inhabitants of cities where there are massive renovations, is the principle of housing cost neutrality. This principle means that the increases in rent are fully balanced by energy savings. And this principle can be implemented in the European Green Deal, but as far as I see, ladies and gentlemen, this has not been done so far, and the lobby is too weak to do this.
So thank you, Barbara. I'm going to move on to Nuria, who is from the wonderful city of Tarragona in Spain, one of my favorite places. Over to you, Nuria.
Starts by delimiting the main concepts that guided the research, which are sometimes unclear or not easy to define. For example, we have housing affordability, housing sustainability, inclusiveness, among other concepts. Then we undertook a country studies in order to achieve a bottom-up approach, and we used objective criteria to choose the best practices and to highlight the lessons learned, pointing out strengths, weaknesses, the replicability of the measures and policies. And finally, the result was extracting lessons learned and formulating multi-level policy recommendations for the EU countries on relation to the main housing challenges that were addressed. Then here you can see the most commonly addressed topics by national reporters, which were, I think most of them have already been raised today. The first one is the impact of the process of urbanization, which together with the supply constraint by land scarcity, geographical restrictions, lack of territorial cohesion, lack of social and affordable housing, and also already mentioned processes of gentrification of cities and touristification. This all contributed to housing unaffordability in major urban areas in the EU member states. The second big field that was addressed is social rental housing in two different approaches. First one, the size of its share, if it's too big or too small, and also secondly, its management or mismanagement. And finally, the third big issues mentioned was housing deprivation in terms of lack of adequacy of housing in different fields, need for renovation of the stock, improvement of energy efficiency, and universally accessible housing and independent living, mainly for disabled and aging people. Of course, other issues were highlighted: housing governance in terms of a lack of coherence in housing policies and insufficient data and research in related to housing, migration, refugees, Roma people, housing insecurity, and last but not least, also defended here today, homelessness, and in its different forms, which is a problem on the rise in nearly every European country. Then the lessons learned, I'm not going to discuss them in detail because some of them will be raised now when we talk about the EU recommendations. So the study concludes, as I said, with a set of multi-level policy recommendations or actionable points, 10 recommendations for the local municipal level, 10 for the regional national level, and 10 for the European Union level. These ones are the ones for the EU level, and we can gather them, or I have gathered them according to the lessons learned of the study. The first lesson learned would be to tackle the existence of incoherent or even contradictory multi-level housing legislation, and also the need to produce reliable data and trustworthy and independent housing research to properly orientate housing policies. And in that lesson learned, we have some recommendations. The first one would be setting up an integrated strategy for housing within the European Commission, which could take the form of a potentiated inter-service group housing. Of course, there is a cross impact of housing in many fields, as we have seen here today. And this coordinated approach could also improve the analytical basis of housing assessment and could help decipher the complexity of national housing systems, not only selected elements, but the whole system, the system as a whole. Second recommendation would be in that particular lesson learned, developing a full-fledged database on housing matters. For example, to collect data and monitor of housing deprivation, homelessness, housing exclusion, types of housing tenures, housing investment, energy efficiency, and so on. Also to create a better framework conditions for decent, sustainable, and affordable housing via the European semester process. This could be accomplished, for example, by revisions of indicators on housing in the social scoreboard or in the macroeconomic imbalances procedures, taking into account, for example, the housing tenures, the continuum of housing tenures and housing cost of a burden. And also another recommendation is the creation of an ad hoc EU observatory and research center on housing to precisely warranty objectives housing research. A second big lesson learned in the study was there's a need to increase social and affordable housing stock, especially in urban areas. And in that sense, some of the recommendations are, first of all, increasing financial resources, mainly through a better and combined use of local, national, and European funding and European Investment Bank financing. Also through, and it has already been mentioned more than one time, the renovation wave within the European Green Deal, and taking into account not only about improving the sustainability and improving energy efficiency, but important to put efforts on to tackling housing deprivation, which is one of another lessons learned, to precisely warranty this universal accessibility to housing, the need for housing renovation and housing efficiency. And in that sense, it would be also interesting to assess the impact and the results of this funding. Also taking into account the renovations that precisely Barbara just pointed out. Then more recommendations would be to make concrete the right to social housing enacted in the European Pillar of Social Rights, and to expand it to a broader beneficiaries, to affordable housing, to all those people who cannot find decent, affordable, and sustainable housing in the free market. More recommendations in that lesson learned, considering the expenditure of affordable housing and sustainable housing a key investment in the revision of the European fiscal rules, and revision of the target group of social housing in the service of general economic interest definition. So it could include investment on more affordable and sustainable housing solutions. The third lesson learned was already mentioned. The fourth lesson learned, which is to increase literacy in the field of housing among citizens and to transfer and communicate of trustworthy housing research to groups of interest, also adding more proactivity of the public administration and the third sector. And here we also have some recommendations. We can highlight two of them. For example, one would be to create a solid specialized housing cooperative network, increasing the coordination of the EU with major stakeholders organizations, Eurocity, Council of European Municipalities and Regions, DNAJAR. And another recommendation would be to reestablish the network of national focal points on housing policies to ensure There's a mechanism to ensure the exchange of information and knowledges, at the same time scaling up monitoring of affordable housing needs and policies in the European Union member states. And finally, another lesson learned, among others, is to tackling urbanization externalities, which it has already been mentioned today. So we need further research on the impact on financialization and touristification on housing markets, and the common European rule, which has been already mentioned, addressed today. So to conclude, the idea is that in 10 years, the European has been, the idea would be that it could implement all or most of the highlighted recommendations, so that all these full database on housing matters, this research, these integrated strategies at the EU level, the coordination and the networking, the funding and the financing and assessing the impact of its funding, revising some concepts we have mentioned. So all this could provide the EU with the tools to be able to address the multidimensionality and complexity of housing affordability and sustainability through a holistic approach on the housing field. And also that could acknowledge the diverse housing situations and issues in the EU countries, not only the countries, regions, but also cities, which are different, but at the same time face similar and new challenges on housing policies, as we have seen here today. So the final idea that I would like to give you is that all these EU level recommendations that we have mentioned, of course, cannot be considered in isolation, but they require a coordinated policy at various levels, local, regional, and also national.
I'm going to move on to the next speaker, which is Dr. Áine Sperrin, NUI Galway, who's provided us with a pre-recorded presentation.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. My name is Áine Sperrin. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Centre for Disability Law and Policy at NUI Galway. I'm going to speak to you very briefly today about the role of the European Union in advancing disabled people's housing and independent living rights. Firstly, it's really important to recognise the social model of disability, which identifies the barriers in society are what disables people rather than an individual impairment. And these barriers are very evident in housing systems which disabled people interact with on a daily basis. Historically, housing for disabled people has been provided within institutional or long-term residential settings, or have been single units kind of built on the outskirts of towns and cities. This out of sight, out of mind approach is proving very difficult to marry with member states' human rights obligations towards disabled people. While much of the focus on independent living does relate to the provision of personal assistance for disabled people, a systemic change in our attitude towards housing, the design, security and sustainability of housing is necessary. And all of these principles are enshrined within the UN Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or the UNCRPD. So speaking of the UNCRPD and positive examples for independent living in the EU, really the EU should be commended for its ratification of the UNCRPD in 2011. Article 19 then of the UNCRPD promotes the right to live independently, to have choice and control over where and with whom you live, to have access to any assistive devices or personal assistance that you need in order to live independently, and to be able to participate on an equal basis with others in your community. So it's very easy to see that appropriate and accessible housing is really at the cornerstone of Article 19. Through ratification of the CRPD, the EU has undertaken to incorporate disability rights, including independent living rights, across its actions and communications to member states. While all of the institutions within the EU have a role to play, the European Structural Investment Funds have a significant mandate by prohibiting further investment in institutional settings and services which are contradictory to the ethos and obligations of Article 19. This will go some way to ensuring that independent living practices are not considered as an afterthought when it comes to public services, but rather that they are built in from the start, and member states have to make them part and parcel of all public actions. Under the European Disability Strategy from 2010 to 2020, numerous directives have been implemented with an eye to independent living realisation across Europe. For example, there have been directives on non-discrimination, on the accessibility of technology, on governance of public procurement policies, and regulating standards of products and materials used in the construction of houses and buildings. The 2021 to 2030 strategy on the rights of persons with disabilities can also build on the progress made so far. And one of the key principles of the UNCRPD is information sharing across countries, and the European Union is a really good example of being able to share information across member states. In terms of areas of improvement, there are more than 1 million disabled people under 65 and over 2 million people over the age of 65 who still reside within institutional settings, and that's only a rough estimate. Funding through the structural funds and other social funds must embed the principles of Article 19 in their conditions and seek proof of adherence to non-institutional style services. This can be supported by the European Pillar of Social Rights Action Plan to invest in social services which ensure quality for service users. A disability respectful approach must also be adopted in the EU Action Plan for the Social Economy. The current disability strategy would do well to advance directives to adopt universal design standards for accessibility, which have to be enforced in each member state. And this will enable disabled people to move freely for work or leisure, which is a key element of the European Union, and have the same expectation of accessibility across member states. In the future then, the social model of disability ideally would be recognised by increasing numbers of public service providers and citizens. This will be achieved through the increased visibility of disabled people across all areas of our lives, from education, employment, public service, political representation, arts, culture, and sports.
Thank you, Áine, for providing us with that video. And I know that Áine will actually join us for the panel discussion. And I suppose a common theme perhaps running through this session is the need for the voice of people who are affected by housing issues, whether it's disabled people or tenants, to be heard in the European discussion. We now go from Europe to the USA, and we're very pleased to have Professor Marc Roark from the Southern Law School in the US to address us and obviously tell us what the US can learn from Europe. And maybe we can learn something from you too, Marc.
So I want to thank everyone. Thank Podrick for inviting me to come. I'm actually going to focus my talk on the one prong, which is what is Europe doing well? I'm not going to be the typical American to try to come in and say what Europe is not doing well or how Europe can improve, because in this sector, I don't think that the US has much room to offer guidance. I'll start by observing something that has been made clear throughout the day, which is that housing exists in an ecosystem, whether we're talking about homelessness, as Rory described in the previous session, dealing with the need for expanding social housing, or whether, as Barbara pointed out, the role of evictions and the role of expanded social housing access in places like Vienna, or as Nuria just pointed out a few minutes ago, the role of data collection and the ability to communicate that data in various settings. I want to focus on one aspect of the housing ecosystem, which is the consumer bargain. What is the role of contract terms within mortgage relationships, and how do those shape the way we interact with the ecosystem? And to do so, one of the things I think that we need to appreciate is we need to appreciate the fact that the consumer bargain and the consumer transaction is the most organic interaction of consumers within the housing system. It is the place where their remedies are shaped in relationship to their lender. It is often the place where the terms and the conditions on which they will interact with housing are defined, whether we're talking the interest rate that they will pay on a mortgage, or we're talking about the amount of money that they're able to lend in order to acquire housing. And so the consumer contract is a very important space for understanding how do we deal with unfair or unconscionable terms in relationship to mortgage lenders. And so to do so, I want to think about the role that the Aziz case and what Spain has given to the rest of Europe that the rest of the world can learn from. So as some of you may be aware, or you may not be aware, in 2013, a case went through the Spanish court system dealing with an individual whose home was being foreclosed on, and he challenged the terms on unfair, that the terms of the mortgage were unfair, that they provided interest accelerations that were unconscionable, and that the terms of the mortgage should not therefore be enforced. Now, so one of the things I think that's important to understand is that Aziz represented a moment in Spain's consumer contract law where the remedies for consumers were really bifurcated. Aziz could not, prior to the European Court of Justice decision, bring a claim for unfair terms in the Spanish court, and at the same time challenge the foreclosure. Those things had to happen in separate proceedings. And one of the things the European Court of Justice found is that court has to be able to, under the Unfair Terms Directive, be able to provide interim relief, has to be able to set aside the mortgage or set aside the foreclosure in the process of deciding whether these terms were unfair. Well, that is exactly the place where American consumer law finds itself. It finds itself in a place where consumer remedies are bifurcated. And they're bifurcated across scales. They're bifurcated across different avenues of private versus regulatory relief. And so I want to focus on just what the US has done and some of the challenges that we face, in the hopes that you will not follow us down this trajectory. So in summary, it's my view that Europe is providing a guiding light that we should all think about. Its focus and its ability to extend equivalency and effectiveness across the Union is something that the US can learn from. The current bifurcated status of US consumer law between the regulatory and consumer common law contracts that aren't necessarily aligned and don't necessarily inform one another mean that the barriers for consumers to enforce their rights or claims within unfair bargains is even higher and more difficult to enforce. Thank you.
Both Nuria and Barbara brought up the issue of renovictions, and I'm just wondering, how do you propose to tackle that issue of preventing renovictions in Europe? Who wants to start?
Yes.
Barbara, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, we have some clear proposals. First of all, when you check the rent law in several member states in Europe, there are very good examples how to prevent renovictions. And take a look at the Netherlands. For instance, in the Netherlands, 70% of the inhabitants of the buildings have to say yes to the renovation. And if this majority is not reached, the renovation will not take place, which means that you have to make this renovation also a business case for the tenants. And I think this is very important. In Denmark, a very interesting country when it comes to housing policy too. In Denmark, the big housing companies, the supervisory board are tenants. So if a housing company says, okay, we want to renovate our stock, then the board says, okay, you can do it, but it has to be in favor of the inhabitants, of the tenants. this is, I think, quite interesting. From technical point of view, we are very much in favor for the so-called housing cost neutrality when it comes to renovations, which means that the increase in rent, and that you have in all rent laws. If you renovate, you can pass on the costs to the tenants. Some social housing providers are not doing it, but in the private market, it is a fact that we have to see. And this is the reality for most of the tenants. And in the private rental sector, also most of the tenants are evicted after renovations. So the housing cost neutrality principle means that the increase in rent, in the basic rent, must be fully balanced by energy savings, which means that after the renovation, you have the same costs. This is interesting because it prevents effectively renovations, and it is also very good for the climate because in that case, the renovations are made in a very energy efficient and climate friendly way. So these are concrete solutions that we offer, and tenants unions have a lot of knowledge about rent law, and we can offer you even more if you like to. We are there and happy to answer your questions.
Fascinating, Barbara. So tenants having a say on whether renovations happen and how they happen, and also cost neutrality. Marc, do you have anything to say on this?
Yeah, so this is actually an issue that's come up in U.S. public housing significantly, where you have U.S. public housing that's reached a point of being reaching the end of its life because it was poorly constructed in the 40s, and so cities seeking to get permission to demolish. And so couple of things that have happened. One thing that's happened is back in the 1980s, there was a period where cities were allowing properties to fall into disrepair because the federal requirement or threshold to enable the city to do something different with the property required that the units fall under a certain number of utilization. So they would allow this kind of constructive demolition of the project to just devolve. And then the second thing that has happened, or the second relationship that has created, has been this: what happens with the tenants when that demolition, when the property is slated for that public renovation. And by and large, the tenants have the attempt has been made to negotiate with the tenants to leave the property willingly in exchange for subsidies. But just recently, in my hometown of Savannah, Georgia, there's a property slated for renovation, and they delivered eviction notices to 40 tenants to vacate the property prior to January 1st, so that the property can undergo renovation. And so, by and large, the tool that states continue to deploy in that mechanism is the traditional eviction remedy. Even and courts seem to be willing to participate in that endeavor.
Okay, so maybe there's a few ideas there from Barbara that need to be transferred across the water. Berlin used to be a shining light. What's going on?
You know that there are currently 2 cities in Europe where you have to take a closer look if you are a housing expert. These are Barcelona and Berlin. Many interesting things are going on there. I think in both cities we have a lot of progress when it comes to rent freezes, because we heard a lot today about financialization of housing and concentration on housing markets. And when I take a look to Marc, if I just mention BlackRock or Blackstone, we know what we are all talking about. But also this concentration on the housing markets is also a European problem. So we have to, in a way, also check something, how we can stabilize housing market. And that can be done by rent freezes and rent controls, which makes it not so attractive anymore for those profit-oriented investors to enter these markets or to take over these housing markets. We know that the takeover of housing market is a fact. We call it concrete gold. Everybody is entering now, all the money in the world is entering into housing markets, and we have to protect what we achieved here at European level. We achieved social housing markets, affordable housing markets, public housing markets. And for us, perhaps also something interesting, quite far away when you take a look at the United States. In our countries, everybody lives at a certain point of his life in social and affordable housing. As a student, of course, you go to student housing. Then as a young starter at the housing market, as a young family, you go to subsidized housing, to affordable housing. And when you're older or even disabled, you come to a housing institution which helps you to face these changes in your life. So this is very normal for us, and we do not want to lose this tradition, and we do not want to lose that, what we have been fighting for so many years, because all these big investors are coming now to the market and trying to eat up what we built up by public and taxpayers' money. Sorry to be so blunt. And I think in those two cities, Berlin and Barcelona, and I worked in Berlin for more than 20 years as a tenant activist, I think we will manage to balance this housing market, which has been completely out of control because of this massive investment. We will balance it again, and it's done really bottom up, from the people,
Barbara.
from the activists.
Tenants are certainly making their voice heard in Berlin, that's for sure. So thank you, Barbara. That's a great point to end on. I'd just like to thank Marc, Nuria, Áine, and Barbara for a wonderful session. I'm now handing over to Martin and Professor Howells to finish the event. Thanks.
Yes, thank you indeed to all the speakers, and indeed to you, Bob, for chairing the panel so well. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. So indeed, to conclude this afternoon's proceedings, to bring the conference to an end, I'm going to pass across now for some closing remarks to my colleague, Professor Geraint Howells, who's Dean of the College of Business, Public Policy and Law here at NUI Galway. Geraint, across to you.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot, Martin, and to everybody. It really falls to me to thank the speakers and moderators, and of course our sponsors, the European Movement Ireland and the Housing Agency. And it's been a wonderful event. I've been pleased to join for at least parts of it. I think special thanks also to go to Pádraig Kenna, who's been the driving force behind this project of housing and social policy here at NUI Galway for several years, which is one of many activities of the centre here. So I really want to thank everybody for putting together what's been a very important conference. And I think my background is actually as a consumer lawyer. When I was listening to the papers, I actually felt a great resonance with many of the conferences I've attended as a consumer lawyer, because you felt that the people were analytical, but also passionate about trying to achieve greater social justice. And indeed, there's a bit of a debate in consumer law about where tenants' rights falls. Is it really part of consumer law, or is it a specialist area? And I was involved in a very interesting project recently on what we call lifetime contracts, which we included consumer credit, employment contracts, and tenancy contracts. And although we had some tenancy laws in that, they weren't enough. And so we actually hope to reach out to you, I think, to embrace more work with the crossover between consumer and tenancy law. Indeed, part of my substantive contribution was actually said already by Marc when he was talking about the Aziz case and the way in which consumer law came along, sort of like a jack in the box, to help out the problems of the over-indebted Spanish consumers. We've also seen that happen in Eastern Europe, where the problem was about people using Swiss currency mortgages and the problems they faced when there was a big revaluation of the Swiss franc, which made what looked at the time a very attractive financial proposition a complete disaster. And there the European Court again used unfair contract terms law, this time using transparency as a principle to try to achieve social justice in those cases. Thank you for allowing me to attend today. Thank you for allowing me to have a few words to contribute to the discussion. But most of all, thank you all for such a positive, stimulating discussion, which is addressing truly a major social issue for our societies at the moment.